Hi everyone. Today I thought we'd talk a little bit about this photograph that I took at one of the protests of the Tamil families that disappeared in northern Sri Lanka. This was taken at the 365th day mark at the protest site in Maruthankani in Jaffna. And all the families from the different sort of sites where the protests were taking place in the north and east sort of gathered at this site on that day. And I think nearly 2 years later, over 2 years later, the protests are still ongoing. I think it's past the 1,600th day mark now. So I'd be interested to hear a little bit about, what you thought about the image and the protest and the use of images in the protest, but also maybe points of connection to your own work and your own sites in relation to the sort of political uses of everyday photography.
Yeah, thanks, Vindhya. It's an amazingly strong image. Can you tell us something about the source of the original ID images?
Sure. So, I mean, we see different kinds of images used in the protest site. So, we have these sort of flex banners in the back, the printouts in the front that the family members are holding up. These are almost entirely studio images. So, they're either identity photography images that were taken at, studios in, northern Sri Lanka, or they're also sort of portraits, which are a little more sort of, used for personal circulations as opposed to identity photography. And we see these sort of very mundane images from the everyday that are used within these sites of political protest. And it really changes the register in which these images were intended to be used. So identity photography as a sort of, citizen registration project, surveillance, etc., as well as slightly more sort of sweeter everyday photographs, the kinds of things that people would keep in their family albums, for example.
What strikes me, Vindhya, is the layering of the image. How you have both, on the one hand, these portraits in different formats, but then also the text panels, and then also the juxtaposition between image and text. And in the back of the image, you have these really kind of, I would say highly produced banners, which create these kind of collages of different faces and then with the text. And I'm also struck that there's a multilingual component, which immediately makes me ask, what is the intended audience here? Is it local? Is it international? And I know you have lots of thoughts on this, so I'm just wondering, just prodding.
No, I think that was a great analysis. Thank you, Ileana. The main thing to bear in mind is these protests have taken place precisely because the local mechanisms have failed the families, right? So the audience is the international community, as it were. So we're looking at, the UN, the EU, etc., where people are hoping that there will be some kind of international intervention or certainly pressure to get the Sri Lankan government to release information on those who'd been subjected to enforced disappearances in the sort of final months of the war, but also in its aftermath. So hence the sort of multilingual format, but also I guess all the different kinds of images just kind of amplify the visibility, don't they?
The things that come to mind, is the question, why is the photographic portrait important to them? What kind of work does it do for them? And I'm thinking of what you said about the ID studio character of these images. And I'm thinking of that sort of old discussion in photography theory: do photographs of atrocity end up numbing the effect? Perhaps ID photography and studio photography retains a certain kind of power that is exempt from that kind of commercial imagery of atrocity that would potentially make it something that is normalized. And I'm also thinking of a very different geographically and culturally, in some ways, example of how the photographic portrait was extremely important in all kind of commemorative practices in rural Greece of German atrocity and of later museums. The first thing that all of these institutions and people did was to try and locate portraits from ID, from studios, from wherever possible, from back in the 40s, because it was as if we had no image of these deceased, murdered people, their status was undermined, jeopardized. Without the portrait, they didn't exist in some way.
It strikes me, Vindhya, that there's a kind of interesting process of reflecting back to the state occurring. I understand that it may well be that these images are the only images that are available, but part of the political demand seems to involve taking that image that was initially demanded by the state, and then reflecting it back, presenting it back, addressing it back to the state as a different kind of demand. And one's also struck by the regularity, the kind of the equality of the image, so that because they all essentially similar format and similar or same size, one gets a powerful sense of a demand for citizenship to be equally distributed in the way that photographic presence is equally distributed.
I think also for me, I find it very, very striking on two levels. In Nigeria, there's an equivalence of sameness that's attached to the ID photograph in terms of its ubiquity in so many different situations. You're requested to bring 3 ID photographs, 6 ID photographs. So everybody recognizes the visibility of someone as a citizen of the state or of the community, because that's in a way that's what the ID photograph bequeaths. But at the same time, I was struck in Nigeria in the Bring Back Our Girls early protests around Falomo Square is that they took the format of the ID photograph in terms of the red, usually it's against a red curtain, so it has a red background, but instead of actually having the actual image of the girls, which could have been also to do with logistics, because this was in Lagos and the atrocities that happened in the north of the country, was they just had a silhouette of a female form, so no features, just a black silhouette, and then the name of the girl, of the different girls. So that's what would differentiate each silhouette. But also what people said to me when I inquired about this was also it was to evoke that could be anybody's daughter, as opposed to ethnicizing those differences that politics plays on of different ethnicities, and just say, even though you're in Yoruba land in Lagos, this could also be your daughter. But at the same time, there's a lot of resistance in Nigeria at showing actual atrocity images of dead bodies or bodies that have been mutilated. So I don't know if you have found the same resistance in Sri Lanka.
No, I think atrocity images are in very public circulation, right? So, I mean, it's not really shown in this particular protest site, but one of the other ones that I did work in, these sort of ID photographs and portraits were sort of displayed alongside trophy photographs that were captured by soldiers at the end of the war, which sort of shows scenes of executions, for example. So, you know, those kind of were used side by side. And this is also because of how atrocity imagery was used as a part of the sort of political socialization of citizens during this sort of, you know, 3 or so decades of war, in order to kind of, you know, ethnicize the other, but also sort of enumerate the ways in which, you know, bodies are being violated by the state or by the enemy, depending on who was using the atrocity image how. But I think your comment on silhouettes was really interesting. And Kostis, I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit about your own use of silhouettes in the museum space.
Yeah, I mean, it's along the lines of the comment that unless you have a visual figure, you don't have a historical figure, i.e. you need a portrait, or in the absence of a portrait, these museums, when portraits were not able to be retrieved by the families, they replaced them with a black silhouette. And I mean, my understanding of this, my interpretation is that you still need the visual figure if you're going to have to register someone as a historically deceased, murdered person. In order for the historical to exist, you need the visual figure, the photographic first, but in the absence, But the thing that I wanted to ask you very briefly was, there's a question of globality also in the gesture of holding a portrait. So there's something very culturally distinctive, locally distinctive, as Nalu sort of pointed out in relation to Nigeria, but the gesture is a very globally familiar gesture of holding a portrait and reflecting it back, as Chris said, to the state. So maybe there's also a question, something to be considered there about how photography, holding a photograph, becomes part of a global language or a global political gesture.
Yeah, I think that's very important observation, Kostis. But I wonder, Vindhya, could you also say something about how these the images as objects are treated? Because I mean, obviously they're a sign that's part of this kind of global distributed information, but they're also proxies for the missing bodies of loved ones. So, I mean, what did you observe as an anthropologist in the way people treated the images as these stand-ins for absent presences?
Yeah, I mean, what was really interesting, I mean, I wanted to talk about two things. First thing in relation to what Nalu said as well, and what you said earlier as well about the kind of, frontality of these ID photographs. One of the kind of more haunting and disturbing sort of things about this was also that a lot of the older protesters who'd kind of lost very young children felt that using these sort of photographs would help them, if they were still alive, to recognize themselves in case they didn't recognize their family members. So there was that element to it as well, which is obviously very, very sad, because some of those who were disappeared were under the age of 10, right? So many years later, they would maybe recognize themselves in these images, even though they wouldn't necessarily recognize their grandparent, for example. And the second thing is there are two sets of images at these sites. There's the ones that are put on display. So as I think Ileana said, they are produced, to be put on display. And as you see, the ones that they're holding up are sort of images that are printed on A4 sheets and then laminated, right? But on quieter days where demonstrations are not taking place, you do have family members who sort of have these little plastic bags with state documents and sort of personal photographs that they keep with them, right? Which becomes another sort of layer of photography to these sites, which are a bit more private. There are other kinds of photographs, which are maybe like, group shots or like, images from, birthday parties and things like that, which sort of chart the life events or the sort of, short lives of those who disappeared. So it's interesting in that sense, because those are brought out usually if they want to sort of tell a story on a quieter day, as opposed to sort of make these sort of gestures and claims on days of where demonstrations are held.
I was also thinking, Vindhya, how this image very much resonates with practices in Latin America, where since the authoritarian regimes, practices that have been in place since the authoritarian regimes of the 70s and 80s, in contexts as broad as Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, Central America, and including more recently, already in the 70s, actually, in Nicaragua. But I was thinking also about how in the Latin American context, the way in which the image is carried in procession, which, kind of blink to Catholic processions of saints. So there's kind of a greater history of engaging with images in public space that, can't really get into now, but I'm just focusing specifically on this political use of the image in public space to respond to the state, to create a demand, to issue a demand towards the state. And it's not just the carrying of these images in procession. And actually, when you see documentation of these portraits of different sizes, it's almost like the disappeared are incorporated as part of the crowd, like when you see kind of the overview with people carrying. So it's almost like they're still amongst us. They're still a part of us being us, the citizenry. So I think it's something really, really powerful. And also there's a greater mechanism of memory that's being engaged, because ever since then, given that the state in the majority of these, in all of these contexts, has not yet given full answers as to what happened to these people, there's a mechanism of memory that's kept engaged kind of in perpetuity until that kind of those answers will be provided. So the pictures are later incorporated into different types of memorials, and they circulate in public space to date. And I think that that's something that's really, really powerful also, that so not only kind of in the present, the image being used specifically to issue certain demands as part of a protest, but also as a kind of a continuity of time, whereby the image continues to inhabit public space, continuing to issue that demand that's kind of made very personal through this very private portrait, often retrieved from grieving families.
Oh, absolutely. And I think there's also something to be said about the act of carrying the photograph, right? The kind of maternal, in this case, relationship that's asserted in how the protesters' bodies themselves they become a kind of proxy, right? That's sort of made visible and present by way of this photograph or the use of the photograph, and how then in the kind of re-photography of these sites where sort of journalists or other media workers concerned adds another layer to it, right? Because they're often photographing these images as cupped in the hands of the protesters, or the protesters become a part of those recirculated images in sort of interestingly kind of cropped ways. So I think that's another element. But yeah, absolutely, I think a lot of these protesters were, I mean, there's a bigger question of sort of global solidarities and aesthetics, right? And the kind of awareness that exists about these movements that are happening many thousands of miles away, but are still kind of within the understanding of something that communicates something or evokes something in terms of what they are demanding in terms of answers or accountability.